In the winter of 1832, a man sat down to write a series of letters that would help extinguish any hope of ending slavery in Virginia. His name was Benjamin Watkins Leigh, and while most Americans have never heard of him, the ideas he championed would shape the destiny of millions. He was not a plantation owner with thousands of enslaved people. He was something far more dangerous to the cause of freedom. He was the legal mind that gave slavery its constitutional armor. Virginia in the early 19th century was not merely another slave state. It was the birthplace of American slavery, the place where the first Africans had been brought to English North America in 1619. By 1830, nearly 500,000 black men, women, and children lived in bondage within its borders, the largest enslaved population of any state in the Union. Virginia had also been the birthplace of American liberty, home to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington, men who had written soaring words about freedom while holding human beings as property. And by the 1830s, Virginia was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming the largest slave trading center in the Upper South, selling tens of thousands of human beings to the cotton fields of the Deep South. Richmond's slave markets were processing a human cargo that would ultimately number close to 2 million souls. Into this contradiction stepped Benjamin Watkins Leigh, a man who would dedicate his formidable intellectual powers to ensuring that the system of human bondage would not merely survive in Virginia, but would be constitutionally protected from any attempt at reform. He was born on June 18, 1781, at a place called Gravel Hill, the glebe of Dale Parish in Chesterfield County, Virginia. His father was the Reverend William Leigh, an Episcopalian minister who had protested British taxation in 1774 as one of 10 clergymen who signed their names to a petition against colonial oppression. The revolutionary generation had understood tyranny when they saw it inflicted upon themselves. Their children would prove less perceptive when it came to the tyranny they inflicted upon others. The Reverend William Leigh died in 1787, when Benjamin was just 6 years old. His mother, Elizabeth Watkins Leigh, descended from a prominent Virginia family, died 12 years later in 1799. The young Benjamin and his brother William were raised by a private tutor named Needler Robinson, and Benjamin received the education typical of Virginia's elite. He attended the College of William and Mary, where he studied law under some of the most distinguished legal minds in America. Among his instructors was St. George Tucker, a jurist who had actually proposed a plan for gradual emancipation in Virginia. And possibly George Wythe himself, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who had manumitted his own slaves and who believed, as Leigh himself would later acknowledge in writing, that objections to Black Day people were founded merely in prejudice. Leigh graduated in 1802 and was admitted to the bar that same year. Almost immediately, a controversy arose that would reveal something essential about his character. When seeking admission to practice law, Leigh refused to take the required oath against dueling, arguing that as an attorney, he was an officer of the court and should not be subjected to such requirements. The court initially denied his admission, but Leigh delivered such a powerful argument that the justices relented and admitted him anyway. This would become the pattern of his career. Leigh possessed a formidable intellect and an even more formidable will, and he used both to bend institutions to his purposes. He began practicing law in Petersburg, Virginia, and quickly gained a reputation as one of the finest attorneys in the state. In that same year of 1802, he married his cousin, Mary Selden Watkins, with whom he would have one child before her death in 1813. After her passing, he married Susanna Colston, the niece of Chief Justice John Marshall, binding himself ever closer to Virginia's ruling elite. After Susanna's death, he would marry a third time, to Julia Wickham, daughter of the eminent Richmond lawyer John Wickham. Through his marriages and his career, Leigh wove himself into the fabric of Virginia's aristocracy. In 1811, Leigh was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, representing Dinwiddie County. He would serve until 1813, and it was during this period that he first articulated a position that would define his political career. The question at hand was whether state legislatures had the right to instruct their senators in Congress how to vote. Leigh argued passionately that they did, but with certain important exceptions. If the instructions required a violation of the Constitution or an act of moral turpitude, the senator was not bound to follow them. This seemingly arcane legal argument would come back to haunt him decades later, when the Virginia legislature instructed him to do something he found unconscionable, not because it violated morality, but because it offended his political sensibilities. After his legislative service, Leigh moved to Richmond and devoted himself to building what would become one of the most successful legal practices in Virginia. His reputation grew, and in 1819, the legislature appointed him to supervise the compilation and publication of the Code of Virginia. This was no small task. It was the first true codification of Virginia's statutes, an attempt to organize the chaotic mass of laws that had accumulated since the colonial period into a coherent system. Leigh worked alongside William Waller Heening and William Mumford to produce the Revised Code of 1819, a 2-volume work that would serve as the foundation of Virginia law for decades. The Code of 1819 contained within it all the laws that governed the lives of enslaved people in Virginia. The slave codes that dictated who could be bought and sold, who could be separated from family, who could be whipped, who could be killed for attempting escape. By organizing and publishing these laws, Leigh was not merely a passive observer of the slave system. He was one of its architects, giving it the legal structure it needed to function efficiently. The man who compiled Virginia's laws was ensuring that the laws governing human bondage would be clear, accessible, and enforceable. But Leigh's most consequential contribution to the preservation of slavery was yet to come. In 1829, after decades of agitation, Virginia finally convened a constitutional convention to address growing tensions between the eastern and western parts of the state. The Constitution of 1776, written during the Revolutionary War, had established a system that gave disproportionate power to the eastern counties, where slavery was most prevalent. It required property ownership to vote, effectively excluding most white men from the franchise, and it counted enslaved people in determining legislative representation, giving slaveholders a political power based on the very human beings they held in bondage. By the 1820s, Virginia was one of only 2 states in the Union that still limited voting to property owners. The western counties, where slavery was rare and the terrain made plantation agriculture impractical, demanded reform. They wanted representation based on white population, not property. They wanted universal suffrage for white men. They wanted, in short, democracy, at least for white people. The Eastern planters saw these demands as an existential threat. If representation were based on white population, the western counties would eventually control the legislature. And if they controlled the legislature, they might do something about slavery. The convention that assembled in Richmond in October 1829 has been called the last gathering of giants. James Madison was there, now 78 years old, frail but still sharp. James Monroe, who had served as the 5th President of the United States, was elected presiding officer until his failing health forced him to withdraw in December. John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was there. John Randolph of Roanoke, the eccentric and brilliant congressman, was there. These were the men who had made the Revolution, who had written the Constitution, who had built the Republic, and they had come to Richmond to make sure that slavery would endure. Benjamin Watkins Leigh represented Chesterfield County at this convention, following in the footsteps of his ancestors who had represented that same county at the Virginia Convention of 1776. He was 48 years old, at the height of his powers, and he quickly emerged as the leader of what was called the Lowland or Eastern Party, the faction that sought to preserve the political dominance of the slaveholding elite. A contemporary description noted that Leigh was armed at all points as the leader of the Eastern Party, a formidable debater who combined intellectual rigor with relentless determination. The central question before the convention was representation. The Western reformers, led by Philip Doddridge of Brooke County, demanded that both houses of the legislature be apportioned based on white population alone. The Eastern conservatives, led by Leigh, demanded that property, including enslaved human beings, be counted in determining representation. This was not merely an abstract constitutional question. It was a question of power. If white population alone determined representation, the slaveholders would eventually lose control. If property and slaves were counted, they would maintain their grip indefinitely. Leigh argued that property was the foundation of civilized society, and that those who owned property had a greater stake in good government than those who did not. He defended property qualifications for voting, arguing that men without property could not be trusted with the franchise. And he fought against proportional representation, insisting that the existing system, which gave Eastern counties far more legislative seats than their white population warranted, must be preserved. At heart, Leigh was defending minority rule. He was defending the right of a wealthy slave-holding elite to dominate a state where they were outnumbered. The debates were heated. At one point, the reformers quoted Thomas Jefferson in support of universal white manhood suffrage. Randolph responded that the East was not to be struck down with the authority of Mr. Jefferson. The reformers quoted the Declaration of Independence. The conservatives quoted the rights of property. For weeks, the convention seemed deadlocked, with some observers fearing that Virginia might actually split apart over the question of representation. In the end, a compromise was reached, but it was a compromise that heavily favored the slaveholders. The new Constitution slightly relaxed property requirements for voting, extending the franchise to long-term leaseholders and male heads of household who paid taxes. But it preserved the essential structure of Eastern dominance. Representation in the legislature would be apportioned in a way that guaranteed Eastern control of both houses, even as Western population continued to grow. The three most important roll calls were close. The white population basis of apportioning the General Assembly failed by just 2 votes. The extension of the vote to all free white males failed by just 2 votes. When the popular election of governor passed on its first vote, it failed on reconsideration. The Constitution of 1830 was, as historians have noted, a triumph of traditionalism. It preserved the political power of slaveholders at the expense of democracy for white Virginians. And Benjamin Watkins Leigh was its principal architect. He had successfully fought off every attempt at meaningful reform, ensuring that the planter class would continue to dominate Virginia politics for another generation. When the Constitution was submitted to voters for ratification in April 1830, it passed statewide but was overwhelmingly rejected in the western counties. The vote within what would become West Virginia stood 1,383 for ratification and 8,365 against. The divisions that would eventually split Virginia apart were already visible. But slavery's defenders would soon face a far more serious challenge than constitutional reform. On August 21, 1831, an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner led a rebellion in Southampton County that would shake Virginia to its foundations. Turner and his followers killed approximately 60 white people before they were suppressed by militia forces. In the aftermath, white mobs killed more than 100 black people, whether they had participated in the rebellion or not. Turner himself evaded capture for 6 weeks before being caught, tried, and hanged on November 11, 1831. The Turner Rebellion terrified white Virginians. Here was proof that enslaved people were not content with their condition, that they yearned for freedom so desperately that they would kill and die for it. Governor John Floyd himself began to contemplate ending slavery, viewing emancipation as the only way to prevent future violence. In January 1832, the Virginia legislature held an unprecedented debate on the abolition of slavery. For 2 weeks, delegates argued about whether and how to end the institution that had shaped Virginia since its founding. Thomas Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, introduced a plan for gradual emancipation. Some delegates quoted the Declaration of Independence and argued that slavery was incompatible with American principles. Others admitted that slavery was an evil, but argued that emancipation was impractical. Benjamin Watkins Leigh watched these debates with alarm, and in February 1832 he published a series of letters under the pseudonym Appomattox that would help shut down any further discussion of emancipation. The letter of Appomattox to the people of Virginia attacked the abolitionists in the legislature, mocked their proposals, and warned of the dire consequences that would follow any attempt at emancipation. Writing in the Richmond Enquirer, Leigh acknowledged that his own teacher, George Wythe, had been in favor of simple abolition, and had considered objections to color as founded in prejudice. But Leigh rejected his teacher's views. He argued that enslaved people were happier in their condition than they would be if freed, writing that they should remain enslaved because their lives were better as slaves than they would be in any other situation. This was a significant shift in the defense of slavery. Earlier generations of Virginia slaveholders had often acknowledged that slavery was an evil, even if they believed it was a necessary one. Leigh and his contemporaries were moving toward a new position, one that would become known as the positive good theory of slavery. Rather than apologizing for slavery, they were celebrating it. Rather than hoping it would eventually end, they were determined to make it permanent. At the same time, Professor Thomas Roderick Dew of the College of William and Mary was writing his review of the debate in the Virginia legislature of 1831 and 1832, which would become the foundational text of pro-slavery ideology. Dew argued that slavery was ordained by God, that black people were destined to be enslaved, and that emancipation could never work. He dismissed colonization as impractical and noted that Virginia profited from being a slave-raising state, selling human beings to the Deep South. Between Leigh's political polemics and Dew's intellectual theorizing, the window for ending slavery in Virginia was slammed shut. The legislature rejected all proposals for emancipation, and instead passed new laws restricting the lives of enslaved and free black people even further. In 1831, same year as the Turner Rebellion, Leigh was one of the founding members of the Virginia Historical and Philosophical Society, which would later become the Virginia Historical Society. The organization elected Chief Justice John Marshall as its first president and former President James Madison as its first honorary member. It was established to preserve the memory of Virginia's colonial and revolutionary past, to celebrate the golden age of Virginia's founding. That these men saw no contradiction between celebrating liberty and preserving slavery tells us everything we need to know about the blindness of the era. Leigh's national prominence grew during the nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833. When South Carolina declared federal tariffs null and void within its borders and threatened to secede, Virginia found itself in a difficult position. Most Virginians opposed nullification as a constitutional doctrine, but they were also sympathetic to South Carolina's grievances about federal overreach. The Virginia legislature sent Leigh to Charleston as a commissioner, bearing resolutions that criticized both President Jackson and the nullifiers. Leigh's mission was to mediate between the federal government and South Carolina, to urge the nullifiers to back down without forcing a military confrontation. Every state had expressed disapproval of South Carolina's nullification, and it was Leigh who was sent to urge South Carolina to desist from carrying matters to extremities. The crisis was ultimately resolved through compromise, with Congress passing both a new tariff and a force bill authorizing the president to use military force if necessary. In February 1834, the Virginia legislature appointed Leigh to the United States Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of William Cabell Rives. He was re-elected in 1835 by the narrow margin of just 2 votes. In the Senate, Leigh continued his defense of slavery, most notably in a speech delivered on January 19, 1836, opposing the reception of petitions from citizens of Ohio praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Abolitionists had launched a massive petition campaign, flooding Congress with demands to end slavery in the nation's capital. Leigh argued that these petitions should not even be received, that Congress had no business considering the question of slavery at all. Leigh also proposed a statewide boycott of pro-emancipation newspapers, writing that Virginians had the right to suppress to the utmost of our power what we deem inflammatory, dangerous, mischievous. This was a remarkable statement from a man who had built his career on legal argumentation. He was now advocating for the suppression of free speech and free press when it came to the question of slavery. The peculiar institution had become so central to Virginia's identity that even its most brilliant legal minds were willing to abandon fundamental principles to protect it. The crisis that ended Leigh's Senate career came not over slavery, but over President Andrew Jackson. In 1834, the Senate had passed a resolution censuring Jackson for his actions in removing federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. Jackson's supporters demanded that this censure be expunged from the record. When the Virginia legislature instructed Leigh and his fellow senator John Tyler to vote for expunging, Tyler complied and then resigned. Leigh refused to do either. In a letter of noble dignity, he reminded the legislature of his earlier position on instruction. He had always maintained that senators were bound to follow the instructions of their state legislatures, except when those instructions required a violation of the Constitution or an act of moral turpitude. Leigh argued that expunging the censure would violate the Constitution's requirement that the Senate keep a journal of its proceedings. He could not, in good conscience, comply. On July 4, 1836, Leigh resigned from the Senate. He had served for only 2 years, but his impact had been significant. He had helped defeat anti-slavery petitions, defended the rights of slaveholders, and articulated a constitutional vision that placed property rights above human rights. The Virginia legislature passed resolutions of censure against him, but Leigh reportedly bore them as unconcernedly as he had worn his honors. After leaving the Senate, Leigh returned to Richmond and resumed his legal practice. From 1829 until 1841, he served as the reporter for the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, compiling and publishing the decisions of the state's highest court. In 1835, the College of William and Mary honored him with a doctorate in laws. He continued to be a prominent figure in Virginia society, though he never again held public office. Benjamin Watkins Leigh died on February 1949 in Richmond. He was 67 years old. He was buried in Shockoe Hill Cemetery, the same ground where enslaved people had been buried in unmarked graves, the same city where the slave markets continued to process their human cargo. His house in Richmond would later be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, preserved as a monument to his legal and political career. In assessing his legacy, contemporaries praised Leigh's intellect and his eloquence. One account noted that according to the lawyer's traditions, he worked hard, lived well, and died poor. Another observed that he was an aristocrat in the best sense in a youthful and impatient democracy. But these assessments obscure the essential truth of Leigh's career. He devoted his formidable talents to preserving a system that held hundreds of thousands of human beings in bondage, that bought and sold children, that separated families, that worked men and women to death. His son, Benjamin Watkins Leigh, Jr., would carry the family name into the Confederacy, serving as a major in the Army of Northern Virginia. He died at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863, killed while trying to rally Confederate soldiers who were attempting to surrender. The father had fought with words and laws to preserve slavery. The son would die fighting with weapons. Both were engaged in the same cause. What are we to make of Benjamin Watkins Leigh today? He was undoubtedly brilliant. He was undoubtedly influential. He shaped Virginia's Constitution, codified its laws, defended its peculiar institution on the floor of the United States Senate. And every one of these accomplishments was placed in service of human bondage. Leigh knew better. He had studied under men who believed in abolition. He acknowledged in his own writings that his teacher George Wythe had considered objections to black people to be founded in prejudice. He knew that the arguments for slavery were weak, which is why he and his allies worked so hard to suppress them. The man who compiled Virginia's Code of Laws understood that the laws governing slavery could not survive open debate. They could only survive if discussion was silenced, if petitions were ignored, if newspapers were boycotted, if constitutional protections for slaveholders were preserved at any cost. The Constitutional Convention of 1829 to 1830, which Leigh dominated, had lasting consequences. By preserving Eastern control of the legislature, it ensured that Virginia would never peacefully reform itself. The western counties that had been denied representation would eventually break away to form West Virginia in 1863, choosing to remain with the Union rather than join the Confederacy that Leigh's political heirs had created. The democracy that Leigh had denied to Western Virginians in 1830 would be reclaimed at gunpoint 3 decades later. The ideas that Leigh championed, that property was more important than people, that slaveholders had a constitutional right to political power based on the human beings they owned, that any discussion of abolition should be suppressed. These ideas did not die with him. They shaped the path to secession and civil war. They informed the arguments of the Confederacy, and in modified forms they would persist long after slavery itself was abolished. Standing in Richmond today, you can still see the buildings where enslaved people were bought and sold. You can walk the streets where coffles of men, women, and children were marched to the docks for shipment to the Deep South. Benjamin Watkins Leigh lived and worked in this city. He walked these streets. He built his career in a society that was founded on human bondage, and he used every tool at his disposal to ensure that bondage would continue. Some historical figures are villains because they wielded the whip or closed the sale. Benjamin Watkins Leigh was a different kind of villain. He was the man who made the laws that authorized the whip, who drafted the constitutions that protected the sale, who silenced the voices that called for freedom. His weapons were words and statutes, not chains and irons, but his victims were the same. The 500,000 enslaved Virginians who lived and died in bondage during his lifetime. The millions more who were sold south to the cotton fields. The generations yet unborn who would inherit a nation scarred by the institution he defended. History remembers the slaveholders who owned the most people, the traders who sold the most bodies, the overseers who inflicted the most suffering. But it often forgets the lawyers and legislators who made it all possible, the brilliant minds who constructed the legal and constitutional framework within which slavery operated. Benjamin Watkins Leigh was one of those minds. He deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, but remembered, because we cannot understand how slavery persisted for so long, how it was defended so fiercely, how it nearly destroyed the American Republic, unless we understand the men who built its foundations and fortified its walls. When Leigh wrote that enslaved people were happier in bondage than they would be in freedom, he was not stating a fact. He was constructing a lie that would justify continued oppression. When he argued that property should determine political representation, he was not articulating a neutral principle. He was ensuring that those who owned human beings would have the power to continue owning them. When he proposed suppressing abolitionist newspapers and ignoring anti-slavery petitions, he was not defending free society. He was admitting that slavery could not survive in a free society. The tragedy of Benjamin Watkins Leigh is that he used his considerable gifts in service of an evil cause. The greater tragedy is that he succeeded, at least for a time. The constitutional structures he helped create, the pro-slavery arguments he helped articulate, the reform movements he helped defeat, all of these extended slavery's life for another generation. And every year that slavery persisted, more families were torn apart, more human beings were worked to death, more children were born into bondage. In the end, it took a civil war to undo what Leigh and his allies had wrought. It took 600,000 dead, 4 million emancipated, and a nation torn asunder. Benjamin Watkins. Leigh did not live to see that war. He died 12 years before Fort Sumter, secure in the belief that he had protected Virginia's peculiar institution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. He was wrong. But the price of proving him wrong would be paid in blood. The world that Leigh helped create was one of profound contradiction. Virginia, which had produced more founding fathers than any other state, had also produced more enslaved human beings than any other state. By 1830, Virginia's enslaved population numbered approximately 470,000 people, representing nearly 40% of the state's total population. In some eastern counties, the black population, overwhelmingly enslaved, exceeded 70%. These were the counties that Leigh fought to protect, the constituencies whose political power he worked to preserve. The economics of slavery in Virginia had shifted dramatically since the 18th century. Tobacco cultivation had exhausted the soil of the Tidewater and Piedmont regions, and many planters found themselves with more enslaved workers than they could profitably employ. John Randolph himself had declared in 1830 that the land was worn out. But rather than leading to the decline of slavery, this agricultural exhaustion led to a new and even more devastating enterprise. Virginia became, as Thomas Dew bluntly put it, a Negro-raising state for other states. The domestic slave trade, which had always existed, exploded in scale. Richmond became the hub of this trade, the largest slave trading center in the Upper South. Firms like those operated by Silas O'Mahundro and Robert Lumpkin bought enslaved people from throughout Virginia and the surrounding states, confined them in jails and pens, and sold them to buyers from the Deep South. The cotton and sugar plantations of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama had an insatiable demand for labor, and Virginia planters were eager to supply it. Historians estimate that between 1790 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Lower South. Of these, Virginia contributed the largest share. Prices for enslaved people varied widely, but could reach as high as $1,250 during the cotton boom of the late 1830s, and rose to nearly $1,250 in the late 1850s. Males were valued 10 to 20% more than females, while children at age 10 were priced at about half the value of a prime adult male field hand. This was the economic reality that Leigh was defending when he fought against constitutional reform and emancipation. The enslaved population was not merely a labor force for Virginia planters. It was an asset class, a form of wealth that could be mortgaged, inherited, and sold. The value of Virginia's enslaved population was measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. When abolitionists proposed emancipation, they were proposing what Virginia's elite considered to be the confiscation of their property on a scale never before seen in human history. The Constitutional Convention of 1829-1830 must be understood in this context. The Western reformers who demanded representation based on white population were not abolitionists. Most of them held deeply racist views about black people, but they recognized that the system of representation that counted enslaved people gave Eastern planters disproportionate political power. They wanted that power for themselves. Leigh and the Eastern conservatives understood that if they lost control of the legislature, everything that depended on that control, including the legal structure of slavery, would be at risk. The debates at the convention revealed the deep tensions within Virginia society. When the reformers invoked the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the conservatives responded that those principles were never meant to apply to black people. When the reformers demanded universal white male suffrage, the conservatives argued that men without property had no stake in society and could not be trusted with the vote. Monroe himself argued that the elective franchise should be confined to those with an interest in the land, and Randolph agreed that terra firma was the only safe ground on which the right of suffrage could stand. When the reformers demanded representation based on white population, the conservatives argued that property deserved representation as much as people. Madison, now an old man, attempted to find middle ground. He spoke of the need for compromise, of the danger of allowing either section of the state to dominate the other. But Madison's compromises had always included an accommodation with slavery, and this convention was no different. Marshall spoke eloquently about the principles of Republican government, but he too defended the rights of property holders, including holders of human property. The giants of the founding generation, gathered together one last time, proved unable or unwilling to challenge the institution that would eventually tear the nation apart. Leigh was not merely a participant in these debates, he was their architect. He had spent years preparing for this moment, studying the Constitution, mastering the rules of procedure, building alliances with other conservative delegates. When the crucial votes came, he was ready. He outmaneuvered the reformers at every turn, using procedural motions to delay their proposals, using eloquent speeches to sway undecided delegates, using backroom negotiations to build winning coalitions. The resulting Constitution was a masterpiece of minority rule. It guaranteed that the eastern counties would control both houses of the legislature, regardless of population growth in the West. It preserved property qualifications for voting, though it slightly relaxed them. It rejected the popular election of the governor, keeping that office in the hands of the legislature. It was, as one historian has written, designed to protect the interests of slaveholders who were more numerous in the eastern region than elsewhere. The consequences of this constitutional structure would play out over the following decades. When the legislature debated emancipation in 1832, following Nat Turner's rebellion, the Eastern majority easily defeated all proposals. When abolitionists petitioned Congress to end slavery in the District of Columbia, Virginia's representatives were solidly opposed. When the sectional crisis intensified in the 1850s, Virginia remained firmly in the slaveholding camp. The constitutional barriers that Leigh had constructed proved remarkably effective at blocking any reform. After the Turner Rebellion, Virginia did not merely reject emancipation. It moved in the opposite direction, passing new laws that further restricted the lives of enslaved and free black people. It became illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. Free black people faced new requirements and restrictions. Religious gatherings of black people were banned unless supervised by white ministers. The window of reform that had briefly opened in January 1832 was slammed shut and locked, and Leigh's letter of Appomattox helped provide the intellectual justification for that closure. The ideas that Leigh articulated in that letter would be developed and expanded by others in the years that followed. Thomas Dew's treatise, published later in 1832, provided the most comprehensive defense of slavery that had yet appeared. Drawing on history, economics, theology, and what he claimed to be natural science, Dew argued that slavery was a positive good, beneficial to both the enslaved and their enslavers. This positive good theory would become the dominant ideology of the South in the decades before the Civil War. Leigh's career after leaving the Senate was quiet but productive. He continued to practice law, continued to report the decisions of the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, continued to be a respected figure in Richmond society. He watched as the sectional crisis deepened, as Northern abolitionists grew more vocal, as Southern defenders of slavery grew more militant. He had helped create the constitutional and ideological foundations for this conflict, and now he observed its escalation from a position of comfortable retirement. The family that Leigh built would carry his legacy into the next generation. His son, Benjamin Watkins Leigh, Jr., grew up in one of Richmond's most prominent households, inheriting his father's aristocratic sensibilities and his father's commitment to the slaveholding order. According to census records, the younger Leigh owned dozens of enslaved people in his own right. When the Civil War began, He enlisted in the Confederate Army, receiving a commission as a captain. By June 1863, he had been promoted to major and assigned as adjutant to General Edward Johnson's division. The path from the Constitutional Convention of 1829-1830 to the Battle of Gettysburg was shorter than it might appear. The constitutional structures that Lee had fought to preserve, the pro-slavery ideology that he had helped articulate, the political power of the slave-holding elite that he had defended, all of these contributed to the crisis that culminated in secession and war. When the younger Lee rode into battle at Culp's Hill on July 2nd and 3, 1863, he was fighting for the cause his father had championed with words and laws. The story of the younger Lee's death is well documented. On the morning of July 3rd, during the confused fighting at Culp's Hill, a group of approximately 40 Confederate soldiers found themselves trapped and began to surrender. Major Lee, seeing what he considered an act of cowardice, rode forward to rally them. He had been raised in a society that valued honor above life, that considered surrender to be worse than death. He could not accept that men from the Stonewall Brigade would give themselves up to the enemy. As he rode toward the surrendering men, he was shot and killed. The body of Benjamin Watkins Leigh, Jr. was eventually recovered and returned to Virginia, where he was buried with full military honors. The vast majority of Confederate soldiers killed at Gettysburg were never identified, their remains eventually interred in mass graves. But the son of one of Virginia's most prominent families received different treatment. His death was recorded, his body preserved, his sacrifice commemorated. The elder Lee had died 14 years before his son, but the cause for which both had labored was the same. The father had fought with constitutions and codes, with letters and speeches, with procedural motions and backroom deals. The son had fought with cavalry charges and rifle fire. Both had dedicated their lives to preserving a system that held millions of human beings in bondage. Both had failed, though the father did not live to see that failure. This is the story of Benjamin Watkins Leigh, a man history has largely forgotten, a man who shaped a constitution to protect slavery, who wrote laws that governed human bondage, who used his brilliant legal mind to silence those who called for freedom. He was not a monster. He was something more dangerous. He was a respectable man, an educated man, a man of law and order, who placed his talents in service of humanity's oldest evil. And, in doing so, he reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with thunder and fury. Sometimes it comes dressed in legal robes, armed with precedent and procedure, speaking in measured tones about property rights and constitutional principles. Sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not by those who break the law, but by those who write it. The Virginia that Lee knew and defended no longer exists. The constitutional structures he created were swept away by war and Reconstruction. The enslaved population he sought to keep in bondage was freed. The political power of the slave-holding elite was broken. But the consequences of his work endured long after his death. The ideas he championed, the precedents he established, the patterns of thought he helped normalize, these shaped the long struggle over civil rights that continued for a century after emancipation. When we study figures like Benjamin Watkins Leigh, we are not merely learning about the past. We are learning about the architecture of injustice, the way that brilliant minds can construct systems of oppression that outlast their creators. We are learning that the preservation of evil requires not just violence but also law, not just force but also philosophy, not just power but also procedure. and we are learning that the struggle for freedom must confront not only the overseer with his whip, but also the lawyer with his brief, not only the slave trader with his chains, but also the legislator with his constitution. Benjamin Watkins Leigh was such a man. His weapons were words. His victims numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and his legacy, like the legacy of slavery itself, has not yet been fully overcome.